Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan and this is the annotation of a game I played against the Stein variation of the King's Indian. So I'm playing white. Game starts out with d4, knight f6, knight f3, pawn to g6. So we're seeing the King's Indian setup. c4, bishop to g7, knight to c3, preparing the e4 move. Black castles, e4, d6. So with d6, black may either play c5 as a pawn break or e5, bishop to e2, keeping the queen, defending the pawn on d4, e5. Now I could exchange the pawns, say if pawn takes pawn, pawn recaptures, queen takes queen, rook recaptures. This is called the queen swap variation. This wasn't played. Instead I played the Petrosian system and I played d5. Now d5 prevents the development of the knight on c6 for the moment. So we're still in book. And now black plays a5, which is the Stein move. Now a5 is actually a logical move. I was planning on playing b4, after which we get something called the bayonet attack. So I call the bayonet when I get this pawn formation against the King's Indian formation of black. However, when black plays a5, b4 is immediately prevented. I need to make two in-between moves. First a supporting move, which is a3. And I need to make a second move, that is move the bishop. Because after the pawns are exchanged, black can capture my rook on a1, which is currently not protected. But I'm planning on playing a bayonet-like formation, so I'm going to have to play both those moves, a3 and move the bishop. First I castle. Black plays h5, gaining space on the king side. Bishop to g5, the first of the two moves. This also creates an annoying pin on the knight. A typical move in bayonet-like or Petrosian-like formations. Knight to d7, so black has little choice to develop the knight. a3, the second move in order to play b4. So the point of the bayonet is to keep advancing the pawns and squeeze black on the queen side. Black plays knight to c5, and I'm just in time to play b4. Now all squares that the knight can move to are covered. So even if the pawns are exchanged, the knight will be kicked away. So the development of the knight on c5 was an inaccuracy. Black retreats the knight. There's little other choice. Knight to d2. So I'm redeveloping pieces in order to support the pawn pushes. Pawn takes pawn, pawn recaptures, and black continues with rook takes rook and queen recaptures. So now I have a queen on the open file, which may attack or pin pieces on the 7th and 8th rank. So white has a clear bayonet-like attacking idea. Black plays queen to e7. I play f3. This move will support the pawn on e4, so I can freely move my knights, which are no longer needed to protect it. Black plays rook to e8. So we can see that black's position is already a little bit locked up. I play bishop to h4. Now bishop to h4 was actually meant to retreat the knight to f2. It's inaccurate. It shouldn't have been played. It's not a bad move, but retreating to e3 would have been fine. So it's a bit wasteful. Main problem with bishop to h4 is that it allows black control of the h6 c1 diagonal. Bishop to e3 would have been better, immediately redeveloping the bishop, or even developing the knight to b3 and continue with the pawn push. But bishop to h4 was played. Black immediately seizes the opportunity and plays bishop to h6. This attacks the knight on d2. I play queen to b2. So there are two possibilities. Either I can play queen to b2, which will protect the knight. This also allows the rook to be played to a1 and take control of the open file. Alternatively, I could have played knight to b3, which was probably even better, saving the knight, because after queen to b2, black exchanges, bishop takes knight, queen recaptures. And now black thinks he has found a little tactical shot against me, and he plays knight takes pawn on e4. So it looks like I can just recapture the knight, but black now has a discovered attack on the bishop on h4 and the queen on d2. So let's take a look at the variations that are possible now. You say knight takes knight, queen takes bishop, I am down a pawn, which looks good for black. If pawn takes knight, queen takes bishop, again I am down a pawn, so that doesn't seem to work. If bishop takes queen, knight takes queen, knight attacking the rook. So if rook to d1, knight takes pawn, check, bishop recaptures, rook recaptures bishop. I'm down 2 pawns. So after black captures the pawn on e4, it looks like I'm down a pawn. But I've lost more than that. I've lost a tactical shot with a pin on the queen, and I've also lost my entire strategy, because my strategy was to push the pawns, but if I'm down a pawn, it will be very difficult for white to do so successfully. So I need to change my game plan entirely. So let's take a look at what I have gained in doing so. The only thing that I gained is a square on e4 that was previously covered by the pawn. So it's not much, but let's see if we can exploit it. The correct move after knight takes pawn on e4 is queen to e1. Now, white is still down a pawn, but black can no longer recapture the bishop on h4 because it's protected. Of course, now I am threatening pawn takes knight. Knight takes knight cannot be played because then, of course, I can grab the queen. So the knight is forced to retreat, and we have regained our tactical advantage, which is the pin on the queen. However, I am still down a pawn, and I still need to find another game plan. The square on e4 has become available, and I can play knight to e4, adding more pressure on the knight on f6. Now, there are still two defenders on the knight, so that alone isn't enough, of course. What I need to do is advance the pawn on the c-file to kick the knight away, or develop a bishop in order to do so. This may lead to c5, then c6, and if take, I can recapture. So black needs to prevent white in doing so. If, say, king to f8, random move, c5, pawn takes pawn, and then bishop to b5, for instance, will kick the knight or exchange the knight, then black will lose a second minor piece on f6. If black doesn't exchange and, say, plays c6, then I can play pawn takes pawn, pawn recaptures. Looks like a solid defense, but after knight takes pawn, I get an attack on the rook and the bishop. If rook d8, bishop to c4, creates an attack on the pawn on f7. And if, say, king to g7, bishop takes pawn, bishop to h6, threatening the rook, queen to g3, will lead to severe complications for black. So, if black tries to defend the pawn advance, he will get enormous positional issues. So there's no real way for black to counter it. Black didn't find that particular defense though. Black played b6. I play c5. Black recaptures the pawn on c5. And I play bishop to b5. Because the pawn advance has now been prevented. So I'm forced to use the bishop to kick the knight. Black plays c4, and I play bishop takes knight on d7. Now this undermines the knight on f6, but also it's not that easy for black to recapture the piece. If queen takes, I can already play knight takes knight, check, and fork. So there are bigger issues than just losing a minor piece. If black tries bishop takes bishop, again, knight takes knight, check, attacking the bishop with a discovered attack on the queen. Now, if king to f8, knight h7, check, winning the queen. If king to h8, queen to c1, and the queen can move in and hunt for a mate. King g7 again. Knight takes pawn, check. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes queen. Black has lost the queen. And if rook takes bishop, queen takes pawn on c4, and black is lost, having lost too much material. Finally, if the king moves to g7, same problem. Knight takes pawn, check. Pawn takes bishop takes queen. Rook takes, and we are in the same situation for black. So recapturing the bishop seems to be very difficult for black. Black finally tries knight takes bishop, sacrificing the queen, and it probably is the best move. So I take on the queen on e7. Rook takes bishop. Queen to e3, looking to move in the queen. f5, counter-attacking the knight. Queen to g5. Now, if pawn takes knight, I can take on the rook, of course. King to f7 to protect the rook. Knight to g3. Bishop to b7, threatening the pawn. And I take on the pawn on f5. A move that speeds up the endgame. It's not necessarily the best move. Pawn recaptures. Queen takes pawn check. So I've gained 2 pawns for a minor piece. It will become very hard for black to defend the third pawn as well, which will equalize the material. Knight to f6 to prevent the pawn loss. g4. Of course, pawn takes pawn cannot be played because of pawn recaptures, and if the pawn advances, black will lose his minor piece. Black gets out of the pin with king to g7. Pawns take pawn. Knight takes pawn. King to f2, opening up the g file. Rook to f7. Queen g5 check. There are other possibilities as well, of course. King f8. Queen d8 check. King g7. Rook g1 check. Now, if king to h7, we get queen to g8 check, which will lead to a mate soon enough. So that can be played. Instead, king to h6 is played, which will lead to queen to h8 check, rook h7, queen f8 check, king to h5, queen f5 check, king to h6, and queen to g6 mate. So that was my game against the Stein generation of the King's Indian, analyzing my opponent's attack and finding counterplay against it. So I hope you enjoyed the game. Thanks for watching and have a great evening.